right, good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so glad to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate hot off the presses, brand new first event, Class Warfare in Black Atlanta. We are here. Yes. The whole title is Grassroots Struggle, Power, and Repression Under Gentrification. We're here with the author, Augustus Wood, and he is in conversation with Dartricia Rollins. We are so glad to have both of you here. I'll introduce Dartricia first. Many of you already know Dartricia, but she is a visiting librarian for oral history in the Rose Library at Emory University. She is the co-founder of Georgia Dusk, a Southern liberation oral history, as well as an organizer with the Black Alliance for Peace and the Jericho Movement. Dartricia is also a volunteer of WRFG 89.3 and co-host of the Revolutionary African Perspectives radio show. She's also, of course, a Charis love for many, many years, and we claim her forever and ever. Amen. So when I saw this book in the UNC catalog, I personally was very invested in it as a native Atlantan, and immediately thought of Dartricia and was like, that's who I want to have interview Augustus Wood. And Augustus Wood is an assistant professor in the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So we are really excited to have you here, Dr. Augustus Wood. We appreciate you. We appreciate you being with us and writing this book and telling the truth in this book and citing all the sources and having all the receipts so people can't talk back. So we're going to get right into it. There will be an opportunity if you are online, you can ask questions. We have a really great big crowd online tonight. Thank you for being with us. And all of you who are physically here, if you would like to ask a question towards the end, just raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic. We want to make sure we get your voice on the mic because otherwise the online folks can't hear you. All right, without further ado, please put your hands together for Augustus Wood.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me. So I'm really excited about this book because it's a book that has been missing for a really long time. A class analysis of Black Atlanta. And as ER said, I was really excited because one, the political economy of it all, and also the use of like archives and oral history throughout the book. And so when I got to the epilogue, I felt exactly what you wrote, which is some will be angered by what they read here. And so could you read the first 2 pages of the epilogue for us before we get started?
Yes. The quote too, or just the part?
You don't get the quote too. Yeah. It's good.
Quote, as I assess our work in the 1950s, one of our problems was that we moved to the defensive too quickly without contesting the terrain at every point. Too little attention was paid to developing limited offensives, for only in offensives can you raise new questions. In the midst of defending political and economic terrain that was important, the old left lost the capacity to project a vision of a viable alternative society. The only alternatives they put forth were cast in terms of the 30s and the Great Depression, revive the New Deal coalition. Are we menaced by a real fascist threat? When you take the racial realities of America into account, this situation requires a more complex analysis because the norms of bourgeois democracy have never been fully applied in the Black community. For the Black community, the major controls are still exercised through the traditional state and corporate methods, end quote. That's from Harold Howe Barron, March 5th, 1981, who was a revolutionary scholar, activist in Chicago who worked with Harold Washington prior to his passing. The preceding chapters of this book will indeed anger many people, primarily at the notion and ample evidence that the callous disregard for the lives of African American workers built the opulent dreams of urban fortune for many wealthy African Americans. Others may object to the contextualization of noted community and celebrity figures as antagonists of the Black masses, driven by their class interests. Make no mistake about it, individuals made decisions to assist in the destruction of Black working class Atlanta, but no specific decision over the last 60 years in Atlanta stands above the others in the system of domination. This book considers all decision makers in the destruction of Black working class Atlanta, as well as other urban centers, to be equally culpable in building and sustaining an inhumane, violent, bourgeois structure at the center of urbanization. In fact, class warfare in Black Atlanta reiterates Malcolm X's poignant point that Black people have often been subjected to the American dream of, quote, democracy, end quote. Bourgeois nature, American history is often written to emphasize the minor, temporary, and illusion reconciliations of African Americans with the state. Thus, Black workers who, by their capacity of resistance, contradict the dominance of the state and submission of the masses, are often hidden in the historical and contemporary analysis of the United States and the world. As radical scholar activist Hal Barron alluded to in the letter excerpted at the beginning of this chapter, the socio-historical experience of the Black worker in Atlanta encompasses the contradiction of the American dream, ravaged by decades of capitalist restructuring and decimation of public resources, demonized and criminalized by bourgeois and petty bourgeois wars against poor urbanites, laid to waste by capital's technological revolutions and the hollowing out of the productive industrial and manufacturing sector, locked out of international beacons of finance, education, downtown prosperity, and real estate affluence, locked down by mass incarceration, and devastated by the retreat from the urban core of the city. Despite the fact that the Black worker has been the most critical component of the growth, expansion, sustainability, and transformation of the structure of the United States and the global economy, scholars often position these forgotten protagonists in the following ways: as either passive objects without the capacity to embody agency, culturally broken over centuries of quote unquote social death, a simple monolithic community in which every member embodies the same political, economic, social, and cultural values, politically and ideologically too superfluous to care for or defend, politically and ideologically impotent, and in need of external guidance or leadership, or spontaneous and apolitical in their protests and quote unquote riots. More clearly, these narratives that restrict the Black worker to one or more of these categories contribute to the depoliticization of Black resistance and the decentralization of African Americans to US and world history. The revolutionary sentiment among the Black working class during Black Power was not a hidden minor squabble in a few select locations. Rather, it tore the core of urban centers like Atlanta apart, thus reaffirming that a sizable portion of the Black population rejected the legitimacy of white authority and rule. In fact, the magnitude of the response by urban power brokers who classified the Black worker as an enemy of progress and tranquility meant that the agency of local movement actors threatened the very restructuring of capital accumulation in the last quarter of the 20th century.
Let's get it. All right. Could you talk about the purpose of class warfare in Black Atlanta and the ways that it is distinct from other books of gentrification?
Yes. So, Class Warfare is essentially a book that is necessary to provide the agency of Black working people as the pioneers and basically construction of historical time, space, etc. Most of the work that comes out on gentrification often, and we go back to books like The Making of the Second Ghetto, Ghetto Revolt, all these other books that emphasize ghettoization, that Black folks who don't have any education or institutional capacity should be shepherded into these small spaces, ghettoized, and then had all these horrible things happen to them. Well, again, that's not a historically accurate picture, and it takes the voices away from so many amazing people who work day to day to survive. When in fact, when you look at books like Black Milwaukee, which I argue my book is, I wanted to be kind of a spiritual successor. No, we have specific conscious decision making powers by building community and institutions wherever we go, because we're not only fighting against white supremacist domination, we're also fighting against the indirect rulers of some of our own people, which is why this book makes the argument that we are in an internal neo-colonial space, that there is a domination over the Black worker. And so therefore, you can't talk about the development of Atlanta as one of the dominant sites of the circulation of global capital without talking about the complete extermination of Black workers from the city. So the purpose of this book is to be a critique of the political economy of Atlanta. Specifically that we have to shepherd in critiques if we're going to create intervention strategies that provide a vision for liberation. Doing studies that are both historically, sociological, and anthropological in nature, interdisciplinary in a sense, provide us with a way to excavate some of the social movements, some of the leaderships, some of the resources, the tools, but also the strategies. Like what actually happened? Who was responsible? What are the structures in place? And we can't do those things without critiques. So the big difference between this book and other books on gentrification in Atlanta is that it makes the case that this is not a commentary. This is not a, well, gentrification is something that happens. No, gentrification is a structurally violent process that began way before we originally thought and was planned to take power away from Black workers. You're going to accumulate capital, yes, but there's a dialectic to it, that to accumulate capital and to hold power over it, you have to remove resources from the masses who will rise up and fight for their right to the city, to the space. And so that's essentially the purpose of the book, is to, number one, put the Black worker where they are supposed to be, at the center of the socio-historical experience of this world. And the other reason is to provide a full critique of the political economy of Atlanta so that we can accurately create interventions for future social movements and hold those accountable who need to be held accountable.
Okay, I'm gonna move around on my questions, because before we get to the critiques and naming names and the people, I think one of the things that you do a really good job at is bringing in the voices of the people who have been repressed, who've been removed, and sometimes murdered. And that is shown throughout every single chapter, in title name, and in the stories that are brought forth at the beginning and throughout each chapter. And so, could we talk about some of the ways that Black power and proto-nationalism has shown up in Atlanta? And then could you particularly talk about like the kinship model that you bring forth in the book?
Very much so. One of the big myths about Black Power is, number one, that it was this random thing and it was a declension of civil rights and it had no focus and no direction, because that's what they like to say about Black working class folk, is that we need leadership and guidance to help us understand things, which is not true. Black Power, in fact, was so strategically complex that they spent months and months debating it, because it was four separate visions of the ways in which we could achieve power for our people. And of course, the Black workers chose revolutionary nationalism, which had tenets of radical socialism, proto-nationalism in it. But you also had Black capitalism, which was conservative nationalism, Nation of Islam, entrepreneurship, those kinds of things. You had liberal pluralism, vote for a Black person, just put them in office and they're going to protect you, do things, etc. And then you had cultural nationalism, which was, the changing of values and those kinds of things. And cultural nationalism is the one that's all around everything. But the reason the Black workers just flocked to proto-nationalism, because it was embedded in our historical experience, in that everywhere that we've gone as Black working class people, we've had to say, these folks are not out for our best interests. We need to control the very institutions that determine how we live our lives. If there is a Black public school, I want them learning Black curriculum that we have decision-making power over. We want to choose the principal. We want Black teachers, and we want to make sure that they are teaching the curriculum that empowers and provides pride. If there's a grocery store, we want to make sure the food is not stale. We want to make sure that our people can work there and can shop there. Those kind of things. We want police to come into our neighborhoods, because every time they come in, they're going to kill and maim and surveil us. So proto-nationalism is taking control of those institutions. And it's a very radical idea, because it's not just to say, well, we want to have these American values and control these spaces and make money. No, it's about changing the literal structure of the United States to where the local workers have decision-making power over accumulation, over profit, over community building, over everything that entails this space. So the workers flock to that, especially when they come to the city in 1970, when Atlanta becomes a Black majority for the first time, and they get here and they find a giant stadium sitting right in front of their neighborhood called Fulton County Stadium. They're like, well, where are we going to live? Oh, we already know this city's up to some foolishness. So they already start working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who was in town doing the Atlanta project. And they said, we want some of this. And that builds to this amazing revolutionary nationalist movement that completely sieges the city. Everything's completely done apart by the labor strikes, the housing strikes, the rent strikes. And to bring it back to your final point of your question, the reason why those things matter is that when you're building community and you understand your neighborhood as a home, there are parts of that provide this trust, that provide this vulnerability, that if I'm willing to do the work it takes for liberation, whether it be small victories like sharing electricity when I can't pay my bill and you can pay it, and we're going to share those things, or bigger victories like actually closing down every Church's Chicken in the city until Church's Chicken gives Black women a union and also gives percentages of their profits to East Lake Meadows neighborhood. So smaller, big victories, those kinds of struggles create community and trust that fortifies a neighborhood and gives it social movement capacity. And so those kinship networks were the first things that they targeted when we're talking about the public-private partnership. They have to break those things apart by going at the place where they develop first and foremost, at the point of production. Take the labor away from the workers. You're taking away resources that Black people day to day use to fortify the relationships, the trust and community that they need to fight back. So this historical materialist perspective is one of the things, I'm sure we'll get to this later, that I argue is missing from a lot of studies of struggle and social movements. There's a lot of talk out there now about, well, culturally, we're not interested in resistance anymore. We're so busy on social media, and the Gen Zers don't care about struggle and discipline anymore. They just want to do this or that. And I argue that that's a falsehood, and it incorrectly projects the history and contemporary moment of the political economic structure of this country. That this book details a specific seizing of resources and annexation of the very labor and land that we were going to use through Black Power initiatives that were so successful in the first 5 years of Black Power in Atlanta. And they specifically went after them to break those kinship networks.
And facilitate gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the Black women shutting down the church's chicken, and Black women are featured very prominently in this book. And I'm wondering if you could talk about why, you talk about the point of production, and we'll get to the labor question because that's what you do.
Yeah.
And it's done really well here. But I want to key in on the Black women who characterize, who are central characters in the book.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, you cannot do a study of Black working class history without the centralization of Black women, especially when you're talking about a critique of the political economy. You have to be honest and look at the decimation of Black women's conditions at this time. Remember, you have Black women who are working outside of domestic space for a few decades at this point. And the first thing they want to do is they want to unionize. They've heard about what's going on in Chicago in the meatpacking plants, Black women shutting stuff down up there. So when the Black women in Atlanta go to the unions say, number one, first of all, you're Black. That's a problem. Number two, you're a woman. That's a problem. And number three, your wages are too low for us to collect dues on. You're not worthy of unionization. You're not worthy of our resources. And this is a prominent aspect of the lack of Black women unionization efforts in the South for decades. And so one of the most important things that Black women understood from day one is that you only got to tell us no once. We're going to organize. And so from that point on, whether it be restaurants, whether it be housing, whether it be any space, Black women not only understood their position in this political economy, but they also understood how to marshal the resources into other spaces. So they would take a labor strike. And I used the church's chicken example because it's one of my favorite things I've ever learned about, ever, that they said, we're going to use this moment to make sure that not only will you get a living wage by unionizing as church's chicken workers, but you have to give every single profit or a percentage of every single profit monthly to the East Lake Meadows neighborhood. And they were already thinking about what was going to happen to East Lake Meadows, which those that know from Atlanta became one of the biggest golf course areas. They were already planning this, but the East Lake Meadows Black women organizers were trying to be proactive. They were thinking ahead, like we have to use this moment to improve both the labor, housing, and community spaces. So that's the strategic nature and the brilliance of Black women organizers in Atlanta. And if you look throughout the book and in other cases I wasn't able to put in there, they did that in every arena because they understood, and this goes back to people like Claudia Jones, the triple oppression of Black women puts them in a position in the political economy to have to think extremely strategically about how to seize power and also how to build power for the whole community. And it's not it's a horrible burden that Black women had to put on. But at the end of the day, what you have is and we'll talk about this, you have some victories, you have some losses, but the extent of the brilliance of Black women organizers and understanding how to do this. Then we go to the 1990s with the Olympic Stadium building and Ethel Mae Matthews, who I think is one of the greatest humans to ever live, and how she said, She organized for decades and was in her older age and said, no, we're gonna still stop this stadium from being built, and just kept doing that work. And then when you look at the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and that fight, those were Black women in Vine City fighting against that. The Georgia World Congress Center, Black women, Vine City and Lightning neighborhood fighting that. Every single time. The privatization of Grady Hospital, Black women were at the center of that campaign. And so you can't deny it that you have, and that's why the political economy part is important, because everybody asks, why is it Black women doing this? It's because they have to be strategically aware of how to fight both white supremacy and intra-racial conflict, class warfare. They have to, because of their positions. So that's where it comes from.
And when you talk about, some of the wins and some of the losses in the case of Church's Chicken, now we're gonna get
now it's about to get spicy, y'all. Let's go ahead. Here we go.
But I want to start this by even coming here, one of the street names are Hosea Williams.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many streets in Atlanta. Yeah. The history of Atlanta is present. A certain history is present. And you talk about the concept of BUR, the Black Urban Regime.
Yeah.
How have you seen them functioning throughout history, and specifically the history that you cover? And I don't know how deep you want to get into naming the names, but like, who are some of the people who stand out as those committing class warfare against Black working class people?
Yeah. So again, once Black power, Black workers, and we're talking about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, we're talking about all these other, we have Revolutionary Action Movement, all these other guerrilla Black organizations on the ground that were causing so much hell for Capital in the 70s. Capital had to readjust. Capital said, and this is across the globe, this isn't just in the US, this is in the global South, this is in South Africa, Black consciousness, this is in South America, where you had darker skinned people rising up saying, this is the time. That's what forces Capital to readjust and say, we can no longer provide labor that offers resources to the people, while at the same time being able to financialize capital. Let's move towards a financial and informational structure. But to do that, we're going to need a group of indirect rulers. We're going to need middle managers. We're going to need city council. We're going to need mayors, but they cannot be white. We have to get people that are plucked from the very neighborhoods to do these things. We're going to need non-profiteers, entrepreneurs. We're going to need all these different people because they're going to be representatives. So they had the Chicago boys, the Milton Friedmans, and all these other folks that studied neo-colonial structures and other spaces. And they said, listen, if we got Coleman Young out here and he's talking all this socialism stuff, I bet if we get Coleman Young in a room and we waved $1 in his face, let's see how socialist he gonna be. And that's what they did. And so Coleman Young becomes one of the first people to basically betray the Black workers in Detroit as a mayor. And so you have Maynard Jackson, you have, and again, Hosea Williams is more complicated. We'll talk about him in a minute. But essentially, this new form of capitalism that comes in 1979, the present day, the neoliberalization of financial capital, it cannot work because if you take people's resources away, if you take away their public resources, all of a sudden now you start seeing newspapers saying we have a budget shortfall, a deficit. That didn't exist before the 1970s. No, they didn't want to give you no money. They just didn't give you no money. But now nobody can afford public schools anymore. No Child Left Behind. Nobody can afford public parks, libraries closed, all these spaces. They start privatizing highways. They privatize everything. You can't do that without expecting people to rise up and fight back without doing this. So you have to have people who are going to represent your mass constituency where Black people are central to the area. And so that's the class warfare we're talking about. I call them the junior partners of capital because they do not actually accumulate capital as these mayors, as these city council. Their job is to direct capital, to move it into an advantageous position, and to also devalue the property of the Black workers by calling them crime zones. That was Maynard Jackson's big push. That his whole thing was that this place, I'm gonna be a law and order mayor. I'm gonna be a law and order mayor, and I'm gonna spend more money on militarizing the police in the 1970s than y'all can even think of in the 2000s. I'm gonna put helicopters, guns. I'm gonna have this very racist police chief, John Inman, and I'm not gonna fire him immediately the minute all these Black kids are getting killed. And then I'm gonna have these television shows that talk about the crime in Atlanta and how it's a death zone and all these other things. I'm meeting with these Black billionaires, Jesse Hill, all these other African-American business owners are all in these groups saying we have to sell Atlanta as a place that has cheap property. But you cannot do that without dehumanizing the very people who live in the neighborhood, who have been fighting for decades for life, for survival, to thrive. You have to take away their things. That's part of that structure. So yeah, as we talk, but then again, you have people like Hosea Williams, who's very complicated because he does believe more than anything else in helping in poverty. He had a very king mindset, but he worked for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which as an organization did not have those same interests. And so when he's going in and he's doing what you saw here in the Church's Chicken and negotiating a settlement that does not provide actual resources for the Black community, then he's doing it in service of the SCLC and their programming. We have to do it this way. And so he has some problematic ideas. And then when they move towards full-blown capitalism, when the SCLC finally collapses, then that's when, unfortunately, Hosea Williams moves more towards the conservative side. So what the book is trying to do is we cannot portray specific community heroes in this simplistic light. There's a very complex way that we have to look at the Black leadership class because they are very complicated. Make no mistake about it. Maynard Jackson would go insane when a Black kid is shot by the cops. Would. But he's not going to say anything when the kid is shot by the very squad that he helped create. You see what I'm saying? Same thing with Andrew Young. Andrew Young made it incredibly difficult to live as a Black worker in the city for decades while he built a mass of wealth here that people celebrate him for today. So it's a very complex history, but we have to understand that this was a strategic and conscious decision that Maynard made, that Andrew made, Bill Campbell, Shirley Franklin, and Marvin Arrington. He's a big person that does a lot of these things. Courtney, the guy who that worked for Shirley Franklin. There's so many of them. The point I'm trying to make is that these are not people who were told to do something. They participated heavily in it. So yeah, no, this is the Black urban regime. And that's why they're called a regime, because they act as imperialists, taking over spaces of Black land, labor, community. It doesn't exist to them as something of value. That's why they're called the Black urban regime. And that term was coined by Adolph Reed Jr., who is in the book. And that's one of the coolest parts about this research is that he's in Atlanta doing this work. And then he goes off and writes this very important piece that people ignored it. When he put out the Black urban regime theory, people ignored it for decades until a guy named John Arena resurrected it, just like they did with Joe Trotter's proletarianization thesis, which we're probably going to get into at some point. But people have to resurrect these things because no, they're saying something that people don't want to hear. It's an uncomfortable truth. But you have a structurally violent human rights crisis called gentrification that disrupts the ability for somebody to live their life on a daily basis. And that's why the focus of it from below, from the people, is the most important vantage point if we're going to understand how to fight this crisis.
Mm-hmm. So, can you talk more about the purpose that gentrification has served in Atlanta? And the book is bookended by, what is it?
The 66 stadium,
The 66 stadium, and then the
Mercedes
2015.
Benz.
Yeah. So, could you talk about gentrification in Atlanta?
That's why the first line in the book in the introduction is Vine City as the World Trade Center. And that's not something I made up. That's actually a Vine City resident who could not breathe. They were so angry at what the city was doing. They said, I feel like that Vine City is the World Trade Center and the city of Atlanta is Osama bin Laden. Yeah, because again, this is the thing that is so important about what gentrification does. And I make the argument in the book that on one side, the reason it was chosen via neoliberalization is because it's a palatable way. You can come up with all these different propaganda tools to give excuses for why it's needed. Oh, it's just so much crime out there. Oh, the poverty. Well, if you go out and start a nonprofit that is anti-poverty and you for gentrification, that means you're going to do something different. No, because what you're doing is and I'm going from the Black workers first before we get to the city, but people who have to move, and in this case, many of them are put on buses with no bus pass to go anywhere, or having to move to an extended stay motel, where it's so bad now that school buses stop at extended stay motels now. You have full-blown communities of extended stays because of gentrification. So we're talking about when you don't have access to housing, that is a human rights crisis. And my anger with how liberals and conservatives treat gentrification as a necessary evil is absolutely wrong. And we need to understand it as a tool of warfare, because you can get away with selling the masses because they'll put us on screen. They'll put out all the 90s movies of Black, quote unquote, degeneracy. Then you have scholars coming out talking about the cultural pathology that Black folks are just backwards and they don't need to have land and have food stamps. The clowns in the White House are saying that stuff right now. Don't give people things because they don't know what to do with them. You have that mess coming out, when in fact, when you're like my the folks I grew up around in the city, because I'm from Atlanta, and you go outside and see people's houses boarded up all the time because they cannot afford to live in the city anymore. What that does to your life is inexcusable. Now, for the city aspect of it, capital, gentrification, because again, what you're doing is you're devaluing the property value. And you're thinking about things like, and I'm not going to get all nerdy on y'all, but you're thinking about potential ground rent. And potential ground rent is a Marxist theory that the first thing I want to do is I want to think about how much accumulation can come from a property. So I'm going to create a high rise. I'm going to hollow out one of those old labor mills that used to employ our community and pay us a living wage because we fought for that living wage. I'm going to hollow it out and make a condo out of it. Then I'm going to put a gym under it, and I'm going to charge an extra $200 in rent for that gym to be there, or for it to be next to a very popular coffee shop. That's potential ground rent there. So again, that's what gentrification does, is you're lowering the property values, and you're trying to realize the potential of adding all these useless trinkets there. Then you think about tax incremental financing, TIF districts, where you're literally stealing public property and trying to claim that it is still public, but it's actually being privatized. So in other words, gentrification allows the power brokers, the public-private partnership of capital, and those city governments to explore other parts of city codes, of urban revitalization, all those things. It allows them to exploit those things. And that's the biggest issue that we don't talk about with gentrification, is that as structurally violent as it is, it also allows other violence to manifest from it being a palatable solution to poverty.
Mm-hmm. Can we hop back to Andrew Young? real quick. He made me real mad. This book.
Yeah, when you get to chapter 3, yeah.
Yeah.
I always knew, because again, my father is not a fan of Andrew Young, but I didn't really know the extent of it until I actually got into. And what's crazy is I found these things in his own archive.
Yeah.
That's the part that really kind of upset me more than anything, is that he and Maynard's archives, they just left everything in there for you to find, almost as if it's like, I don't care that people know that we did these very horrible things for you to find. It's like there's no shame or embarrassment in dehumanizing people, and that was the most interesting part about this research. But
okay, so this is maybe a 2-part question. So you consider the Atlanta petty bourgeoisie as one of the most influential and powerful in the world. I want you to talk about that. And I also want you to talk about how Atlanta was transformed into an international powerhouse.
Okay. Let's do the second one first.
Okay.
Let's do the second one first. So for people that tend to argue that gentrification begins in the 90s and 2000s, what the research shows is that Maynard Jackson took his first international trip in 73, right when he became mayor. And what they would do is they would go on these trips to Germany, to Japan, to Nigeria, and that's when I'll get into Andrew Young in a minute. And they would go with these brochures, and I found all these brochures of how to sell Atlanta. There's nothing here. Think about that for a second. Think about what these brochures and the kinds of messaging they were giving these international banks, these international companies. There's nothing here. That means that they had no care for the community building, all the work that had gone into the building of the Black Belt. And for those that are unfamiliar, that was Dixie Hill, Summer Hill, Peoplestown. That's where everybody grew up. Fourth Ward. They had no care for any of that. Pittsburgh. None of those things. And so they would go to these spaces and they would literally sell Atlanta. We have this new Congress Center we're building, and it's going to change everything you do. We're going to be able to expand the airport, to do all these things if you buy land in this area. And the most heartbreaking part about this, and this is where we get really controversial, is that they're doing this at the same time where people are demanding, where is the government when all the Black children are being killed in the city? They're not in the city. They're in Japan and Germany selling the very land. And so when the first 2 kids are killed, it takes a year and 10 days before this Atlanta city government acknowledges that there needs to be a task force. Not because they didn't, it's because they weren't there. They knew about it and they continued to go overseas to sell the city. And Andrew Young continued it because he comes in after being the UN ambassador. So he used all of his clout that he had as UN ambassador, including some very questionable ties to some oil barons in Africa, some of the dictators that had been left there by the European colonialists. He uses a lot of those powers, and he uses the consultation of George Shultz. If anybody's familiar with George Shultz was one of the Chicago boys that helped infiltrate Chile in 1973 and install the Pinochet government. And the first thing they did there was kill all the radicals, outlaw unions, all the other things. That was Andrew Young's mentor. And so he's coming into Atlanta with a very specific vision about the city, that we are going to turn this into an international city. The quote is in the book. Andrew Young's most famous quote that people tend to forget, he said, "Atlanta has no identity. I'm going to make one." And he says that as he becomes mayor. And so again, the whole purpose of how it becomes this international beacon, you sell the land internationally, then you have the point where the banks come and they set up shop here. I think 80% of the world's largest banks right now have headquarters in Atlanta. Then you have other corporations come in, they buy the land, etc. But then we'll get to this as we're moving along. What do you do with the people who are living in the spaces you want to buy? And so, yeah, that's essentially what it becomes. And now Atlanta is one of the most important global sites of capital circulation because this economy is a distribution hub. And so you have the circulation of capital, et cetera, services throughout the globe because of the expansion of the airport, the Congress Center, the Olympic Park, all these things that they built to showcase that you can come here and we're going to make sure that that pesky problem that happened in the 70s when the black workers were taking everything over, going on strike, going on housing strike, that's not going to happen anymore. We got a police force that's militarized. We got a city government that criminalizes the homeless. We got whatever you need to make sure that you can accumulate in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is, what do you do with the people? And what did they do with the people?
So this becomes the big argument of the book, is that gentrification is essentially a means to sub-proletarianize the black worker. And so when you look back at Joe Trotter's original thesis of proletarianization that came out of his book Black Milwaukee, what he makes the argument of is that when we went into the Great Migration, we did it with the conscious thinking as black folks in the South that we're going to go to the Midwest and the North to get the jobs strategically. It wasn't on some, this is what I love about the thesis, it wasn't on some push-pull thing that we're just so drawn to it. No, he makes it clear, and Kimberly Phillips' Alabama North book does this as well, that you have to have hard decisions that you have to make. You have to raise money. You have to send telegrams. You have to think about when you were going to take your kids. You have to make all these decisions as black workers in the South before you made the decision to go to the North. So there was a consciousness in that, and also the community building effort when you got there. So my argument is that now that we have exhibited the ability to proletarianize and build agency community, what capital is doing is they have to sub-proletarianize us by taking away resources and putting us in spaces that are rural. Douglas County, DeKalb, Henry County, all the surrounding suburban counties. As somebody who grew up around those areas, if you were out there in the 90s, it's till this day, there's nothing out there except hotels for the corporations to fly in and do stuff in. But that's the whole point, is that we want to put black folks, particularly we want to put the black working class in these areas where there are no actual investments in labor sites. So if you're going to work, you're going to be sweeping streets, you're going to be serving drinks, you're going to be cleaning hotel rooms, or because they're building so many jails out there now, you're going to be a CO, which is what they did in Detroit and Flint when they destroyed that labor base. And so that's what sub-proletarianization is. It is unstable, it is low wage, it is non-union, and it is sometimes temporary labor. And the purpose of it is strategic because you're always going to be fighting for more resources, scraps to do anything. And so they're telling our youth right now, these black working class teenagers who can't afford to go to college anymore because there is no savings or wealth, why don't you come break your back in this warehouse, this new Amazon warehouse? We will pay you $22 an hour. Wow. But you can't unionize. Your healthcare sucks. And you're probably going to only work 10 years because your back is going to go out after a while. So it's the physical and mental mutilation of the body that also defines sub-proletarianization. So that's the point with gentrification, is that people don't often talk about what happens to people after they're displaced from the space that they're taken out of. And so there's a whole chapter on sub-proletarianization and suburbanization. Douglas County went from 25% black to 75% black. DeKalb County, Henry County. You have to ask why these numbers look like this. It's because they were expelled, annexed. And so that's what happens to people. But it's not this whole doom and gloom story, though, because just like proletarianization, we find ways to build community. One of my favorite things that I got to study and meet people when I went to the extended stay motels. And the first thing they do whenever somebody has a job interview at an extended stay is they take everybody that stays there takes their money, takes a percentage of their money that they say to buy that person an interview outfit. They build community that way. For Christmas, they don't do individual family Christmases at extended stays. They all chip in to get a tree. They chip in to get each other presents. If somebody has a car, they carpool each other's kids around. They share resources in these extended stays. So we're always building community. And when somebody gets a job, like they get a job as a plumber or a carpenter, then they always send money back to the families in the extended stay, because that's the kinship networks that are embedded in our socio-historical experience as Black working class people. So as mighty as they try to destroy us, we always are going to find a way to marshal resources.
Mm-hmm. So apparently I have to open it up for audience Q&A. Anybody that knows me knows I'm very resistant to that. So I'm going to ask one more question. You asked the question at the end in the epilogue, what is to be done? Oof. And you write that class warfare in Black Atlanta contributes to a framework in scholarship and public policy on reparations. And you follow that with an understanding of Marxist humanist reparations, a case for reparations. Can you talk about that? Yes. And that's going to be my last question. I'm so sorry. I got so many more.
No, we'll talk offline though.
Okay.
Marxist humanism starts at the base that people are first and foremost human beings, that they need food, water, shelter, clothing. And if they don't have access to those things, then they are dominated. They do not have lives that are free. And so when you're thinking about, and that's what the book is written from the perspective of looking at, if you're missing those four things, you're what we call alienated. And so when you put the alienated person at the position, that's what some structural Marxists and leftists don't necessarily like as much, is they start from the structural point, which is important. I'm not saying you don't do it, but I always like to start with the alienated workers point, because if you don't understand that micro level and how the macro level affects the micro level, then you really can't conceive of any intervention strategies. How do you develop political education tools without knowing what the day-to-day struggles are for someone? It's like when we talk about the lumpen proletariat and we talk about the underground economy, or what some out there call criminals, if you don't understand that it's easier to chop a car and get $1,200 a day instead of going and doing this particular backbreaking job at Amazon that I'm going to get fired for when it's not layoff, then again, there's no, when you automatically start thinking, well, this person's doing something criminal, instead of actually asking the question of why this structure exists in the first place, then you're not really getting at the heart of how we can resolve the crisis of alienation. And so that's what I mean, is that when we're asking questions and we're talking about reparations, we're talking about how we can actually conceive of rebuilding or putting a wealth of power in African-American communities, you have to think about, okay, what is it that what are our actual conditions that we're going through? We know that housing is one of the biggest crises, but you don't have a housing crisis without a labor crisis. So the first thing that has to happen is we have to have a living wage. Universal income, which most industrialized countries have. The minute you turn 18, you get a wage from the government. Simple as that. It's interesting that the both the conservatives and liberals claim that would bankrupt the country, but when you look at the economies of those countries that do that, they actually have less debt than the U.S. That's because the U.S. is spending all their money on war. But I digress. Mm-hmm. But you see my point though, is that when you have something like that, it improves the general outcomes for people's health. When you see the studies of what, I forgot that they're in Finland right now, they make it to where there's no issues with school payments, housing, all those things. You're talking about owning a home, being able to actually own land, being able to share community, those kinds of things matter to building the health and well-being of society. And so that's kind of what I believe that reparations from a Marxist humanist standpoint can do, is that we're taking what we know of from the conditions of our oppression, and we're taking those things to say, okay, we're going to create community. We're actually going to give this plot of land. We're going to give South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia to the Black working classes. We're going to make sure they don't have to pay any income tax. We're going to make sure that they have specific sites for schooling and those kinds of things. So resources to rebuild and thrive and restructure how things work so that we can develop our resistance, because once we have those materials, then we fight. Survival pending revolution. And so what is to be done is, number one, political education, the work that Black Alliance for Peace and all these other amazing organizations do on a daily basis, so we can critique and learn and study how to fight back. Then you can build the argument how we fight for reparations. We do these things, and we do it globally as well. We align with the global struggles across the world. And that's what we're hoping happens here. I wanted to put more global stuff in the book, but it was already too long, and they were like, you gotta stick with because I wanted to put stuff in there because there were connections between the Black workers in neighborhoods and communicating with the global South fighters, South African fighters, etc. There was stuff there, but so I'll stop there because I know those questions.
In the next book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
This book is real good, y'all. Real good. Make sure you buy a copy. But I guess I'll let y'all ask questions.
Please.
Who got a question? We got some online questions, so we'll kick it off, and then y'all can marinate. So, so can you speak on the Olympics a little bit?
Yes. There is a chapter on the Olympics in general, and I make the argument that because people always ask, like, what is so special about Atlanta? Why did it gentrify so early? Why was it so fast and nasty compared to other spaces? It's because the Olympics basically accelerated this path. And when you look at other cities that have Olympics, look at what their governments do after the Olympics are over, because they get a taste of that tourist money. And they already have laws in place that criminalize anything that's not wealthy, even working class folks. You remember the parts in the book where they say they go back to old school vagrancy laws. If you're standing out and about, you must be idle. Like this is a Black city government in the 1990s making arguments that Black folks in the city are being idle because they want to sweep the entire area of folks for the Olympics to come in. The Red Dogs and other units destroying neighborhoods. And to make sure that you clear it out, they would do this thing where if it's your second or third cousin who may have been stopped by the police, I don't know, maybe you have some association with them, and therefore you may not be eligible for your housing voucher anymore. Again, there are so many strategies they use to clear public housing before they dismantle it, or working class neighborhoods that were homeowners for the Olympics to come in. And the key thing about the Olympics is that it gave them a taste. We need to expedite now. Let's increase the military, the police militarization. And that's when Shirley Franklin comes in and really digs in deep. Let's actually get rid of public. This is when the conversation about we don't want public housing. We've been wanting to minimize it. Let's just get rid of it altogether so that this city can become a 24-hour tourist site. It gives them the taste of accumulation without Black working class people.
Yeah, all right. And I'll just say we got folks in the chat saying this sounds like Nairobi, this sounds like London, like just to go back to your global.
And we'll be Los Angeles soon.
Thanks for the talk. I was curious if you could speak to people who conflate the conservative and the more radical visions in Black nationalism. Mm-hmm. Like I hear a lot of people say today, like buy Black, but there's a big difference if it's like a capitalist buy Black or, a more egalitarian vision of supporting people in unions or something.
Exactly. Great point. And that's one of the coolest things about the proto-nationalists. When proto-nationalism and the radical socialists in the 70s, they were adamant about political education to understand that you cannot simply just say that all capitalism is something like support. Because again, that was a big question. Should you buy all black? They're talking about, no, we have local spaces. We have local recreational centers that we need to make sure that we're not taking our children to white rec centers. We're going to the neighborhood Black Panther rec center. We're not going anywhere else. Even if we got a carpool, we're going there. That's what I mean by that's what it's supposed to be about, supporting black. But unfortunately, and this is what chapter 5 gets into, that we now have this nonprofit, what I call petty bourgeois activism, where you have people and they believe they're doing activism by creating these entrepreneurship businesses that are corporate minded and supported by corporate spaces. And because they have black symbolism and they use black rhetoric and anti-poverty and all these things, that you're supposed to go out and support them. But then you look at that, no, wait a minute, when you dig up their history, they're actually helping to gentrify a space, or they're supporting very problematic things. And the other thing is that they're very pro-American. That's how you can already know. I'm gonna be honest with you. When somebody is adamantly arguing that they want American in their title, then that should make you raise a lot of questions. And that's all you need to know, because the whole conservative mindset is that we should defend something that never wanted us in the first place. Especially after slavery ends, we become expendable. So why would I dedicate and pledge allegiance to something that colonized my body and mind and my people? And so the big difference that I see is that when I see local neighborhood organizations creating spaces for you to buy things, and you know the money is going back into the community and not going into a profit. The other thing I look at is how they pay their workers. That's one of the most, and I had to take, that was a big section I had to take out of the book. A lot of nonprofits pay their workers terrible wages. And that's why you have to really be adamant. I always say you can actually know someone with how they treat their workers. Mm-hmm. And so those are the ways that I define the difference. Number one, when they're adamant about wanting to be American. Number two, the other one is how they treat workers. Number three, where does their money go? And are they locally based? So that's the big difference. And I agree with you. We need more political education, because it's not just simply buy black. It's complicated. And I think that's how a lot of the corporate stuff gets by, is that they want it to be simple so that you do it no matter what. No, we need lists. Back in the day, that's what it did in the neighborhood. You have a list of places that you would buy from because they have been vetted. Like it wasn't it's on social media, they said buy. No, we actually have proof that their funds and resources are going towards a betterment of the people. And that's what I think that we should hold ourselves accountable to doing.
I appreciate your talk. As someone who's born and raised in Atlanta on the west side, West End, the Cascade Road. But I like how you highlighted a key point in how they went to like overseas to basically sell Atlanta, like basically like pimping Atlanta and exploiting the workers is what we call it. Can you tell how like they're still like doing that today, and like how they're changing the language? Like these big corporations kind of coming in and saying, they're going to bring in more jobs and it's going to stimulate the economy, and how the World Cup coming next year, Super Bowl, and many of these worldwide events that are coming. Can you just kind of touch on like kind of the language they're kind of still doing, and also just connecting the gentrification and how it kind of like, I feel like it drives a lot of classism too as well, and especially in Atlanta. Like I feel like it's become a very just classy city where people get a taste of the crumbs, and they're still oppressed, but now they're looking down on the people who are oppressed.
Yeah, I'm gonna do the second one first, because that's one of the biggest things I got out of because again, I'm a part of a lot of social. We didn't do the bio thing, but I run a lot of social movements. I actually train union workers how to strike. I've actually led a strike myself. I've done other guerrilla work that you know. I've done a lot. I've been in the trenches. And one of the things that I'm glad you brought this point up is that this idea that I'm better than you because I have a scrap or two more. This is something that I've noticed for a while now, because I'm not trying to get all being a philosopher and all this other thing, but to be petty bourgeois, it means that you're trying to ascend to a point that you never can get to. Like you're dreaming of one day, hopefully, that you can be the 0.001% that owns all these things. But that's not how capitalism works. So you're sitting there fighting and treating people terribly and devaluing them because you believe in a dream of something that will never, ever happen. They made a lot of movies about that back in the 80s and 90s about the white petty bourgeoisie when they moved out to the suburbs, like Ordinary People's one of them, and The Ice Storm, where these really upset white folks would be very mad that they realize I can't become the CEO or the boss of something, and it turns into really nasty stuff like domestic violence and drug use and all these. Ordinary People is good. That's the one, because it talks about the alienation. And so, good brother, what you're experiencing, what I've always thought about this is that there is an alienation within the classism that happens because people are buying into a mythology because capitalism looks so shiny and bright to them. And they're always going to feed into it, man. So we talk offline about that because I've been dealing with that a lot. The first question is about the issue of bringing in jobs, and that's where Andrew Young's real reputation comes in, because when they're gentrifying, the first place that they put on a pedestal is Walmart. If you all were here, because I was here when this, again, because I grew up in Atlanta. I didn't leave Atlanta to go to Illinois until 2013. So this was happening right around time that I had gotten out of college. All these Walmart press conferences were happening in the city because Andrew Young was the spokesperson to bring Walmart to the city and offer jobs for everybody. Now, you weren't going to make nothing but $4 an hour, but at least you got a job. They did a McDonald's ad and they said, yeah, we took away your auto plants. We took away the career centers, the worker centers. You used to be able to go into the Social Security office, the unemployment office, and get a job right there, go to a trade school. We took all that away. We took the rec centers away that could pay a decent wage, but at least you got a McDonald's and a Walmart, and that is an economic source to build your economy. You should be proud that we're shepherding this in. And yeah, that's what they do to the spaces, because again, if I'm somebody that hasn't worked a steady job in a long time, then that's supposed to tell me that I can go in, and I have sections in the book where people are talking about just wanting to work at McDonald's because they can't find labor anywhere else. So it is a means of propaganda to manipulate the workers who are in a space where there are no other resources. But the first thing that we should be doing is we need to question the job type. Like when we see the unemployment report, they love talking about how it's 5%. No, the labor participation rate is the real unemployment report that they never bring up. And that is 64%. That means that about 35% of active people living in this country do not have stable work. And almost 50% of people working in this country work in low wage labor. And so again, question it all and start way before the bulldozers come.
I think we could talk all night, but I think we should end on this question because it's a good one. And I want people to have
marathon.
I know, man, it's great. I love it. I want this audio book. I'm just gonna say, I feel like,
well, you gotta call. If you bombard the press,
I'll
they
get-
will
I'll get
do
on-
an audio book if you bombard them.
I'll get on
You
UNC for
Will
you.
you read the audiobook?
I think, yeah, no, I would love for you to read the audiobook. So this final question is: in the last few Atlanta mayoral elections, there has been discourse about what it would mean to have a white mayor of the city. How would the Black urban regime be upended in that scenario, and what would that mean for the Black citizens in the city center and metropolitan areas?
I mean, they've done their job. Yeah, the city is no longer Black majority. There is no livable space in the city. The jobs here, you have to have some type of college degree or you're working in proletariat labor. There's really they did their job. They did exactly what capital wanted them to do in the 1970s. And so now they themselves are expendable. And that's when their dream is deferred. And I mean, seriously, like that's it. There's nothing else for them to do. And that's why you had Mary Norwood come in those few times and come very close. Is because, again, that was the whole argument. It's over. And again, the article that just came out, people are probably seeing on social media that gentrification, that black folks have been displaced, and it's the article now. It's funny that comes out at the same time. The point is that the article doesn't really get at that this was something that had been in play for the 80s and 90s. Black political power was crucial to capitalism in the 80s and 90s, more than it is right now. Because think about this, you have black billionaires now. Where does their capital go? It doesn't go into black neighborhoods. They have black companies now. They don't hire black people. So again, what internal neocolonialism does is that it dominates a people by removing resources, by using indirect rulers from that same group. But once the people have no more resources in their eyes, then they don't need those groups anymore. So you'll still have a few black. They got the new black governor from Maryland who just said no to reparations, by the way. Just happened last week. So they still gonna have. They got Herschel Walker. They got they got that fool in North Carolina. So they're gonna have the useful fools from our people who are willing now to go to the far right. But the basic liberal pluralist black mayor, the Maynard Jacksons, the ones who are liberal but not fully concerned, they're not going to have as much of a space anymore in these big urban sectors as the urban sector grows more white, middle, and upper class. So where do they go? So I predict that you're going to see a major shift because remember, by 1975, black mayors and black urban regimes in general control 80% of the urban space in the country. 80%, that much. By now, it's starting to decline. And I expect that to continue as the political economy shifts and this fascist far right continues to gain ground. But none of that happens. None of this fascist far right stuff happens without what happens in this book. The neoliberalization of space and the removal of resources to have people who have education, who have resources to build social movements, to have resources to have all these things to fight against this foolishness. You have to have a void for fascism to pop up. And so this is a calling to the carpet for the neoliberals and what they want to do.
All right, y'all.
Get the book, y'all.
Thank you to Professor Augustus Wood. I feel like we got taught tonight, which is beautiful. Thank you to Dartricia Rollins, who is always such a thoughtful reader and interviewer. I want to let our folks who are watching online, we've had just a beautiful chat. I just want you to know people are very appreciative in the chat.
Thank you all so much.
And if y'all want to buy this book, you just need to click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy the book online. And for all of y'all who are physically here, you get first dibs on the books while supplies last. If we run out, which is always a happy problem to have, we'll order more and we'll get it to you. So go ahead and get your books. And then if you already have your book, you can make your way up here and Professor Wood will sign it. So I'll bring you a Sharpie and you just stay put.
But can I also say, for those that, again, thank you all for coming out to this. I really appreciate it. And if there's ever my information, they have it. And if you would like me to come and do a talk at your school or organization or whatever, or to help in any way, my whole purpose of doing this kind of work is not to just like go and be in the academy, but I'm on the ground. So whatever is necessary and needed, please think of me as a resource. And I'm there to help because I'm always in Atlanta. So again, thank you all so much for coming out.
Thank you. The Black Alliance of Peace got first dibs.